the Parsha, which is also the end of the book of Exodus, by the way. So perhaps at the end of our Torah study today, we'll join together in a chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, and a be strong, strong, and let us be strengthened, which is the traditional phrase that we say in a book of Torah. So it's a great week. It's a great week for Torah. So let's jump in to Exodus chapter 40, verse 17. We'll read through the rest of the chapter, which takes us to the rest of the book, and then we'll go forward from there. May I call upon a volunteer to read? I'm scrolling now to the English of these verses. If you want to start reading and then pass it off to somebody else, that's also all right. But we'll start here at verse 17 and go forward all the way through 38. Rebecca, go for it.
Exodus 40, 17-38. In the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle was set up. Moses set up the tabernacle, placing its sockets, setting up its planks, inserting its bars, and erecting its posts. He spread the tent over the tabernacle, placing the covering of the tent on top of it, just as Adonai had commanded Moses. He took the pack and placed it in the ark. He fixed the poles to the ark, placed the cover on top of the ark, and brought the ark inside the tabernacle. Then he put up the curtain for screening and screened off the ark of the pact, just as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the table in the tent of meeting outside the curtain on the north side of the tabernacle. Upon it, he laid out the setting of bread before Adonai, as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the lampstand in the tent of meeting opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle. He lit the lamps before Adonai, as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the altar of gold in the tent of the meeting before the curtain. On it, he burned aromatic incense, as Adonai had commanded Moses. Then he put up the screen for the entrance of the tabernacle. At the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, he placed the altar of burnt offering. On it, he offered up the burnt offering and the meal offering, as Adonai had commanded Moses. He placed the laver between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it for washing. From it, Moses and Aaron and his sons would wash their hands and feet. They washed when they entered the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar, as Adonai had commanded Moses. And he set up the enclosure around the tabernacle and the altar, and put up a screen for the gate of the enclosure. When Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of Adonai filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and in the presence of Adonai filled the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until such time as it did lift. For over the tabernacle, a cloud of Adonai rested by day, and fire appeared in it by night, and in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a lot, and you read beautifully. I really appreciate it. So we might think first, let's, before we move into sort of what I want to focus on, I want to just sort of review, this is the rest of the Parsha was about sort of enumerating all the parts of the tabernacle. And here really is like the IKEA moment, right? You've come home from the store, you have all of your boxes of sacral vestments and things, and you assemble them. And so Moses is sort of the assembly man, which is sort of a funny way to think about it. Moses, who leads so much, is also the guy who they say, all right, here's the instructions, please build this, put it together. And so he puts it together very specifically, and then Moses actually makes the first offering within the tabernacle, which is something that I think is glossed over a lot, because we know that Aaron and his sons are the priests, and yet this initial offering is made by Moses. But before I tell you the verse that stops me, I am curious though. Are there any verses or ideas here that either don't make sense, like in a really like straightforward way, just so we can understand what's going on, or that maybe elicit some questions that seem a little strange? Let's see, Rebecca and then Ben. Perfect.
I think the obvious one for me was that Moses couldn't enter because of the cloud. Was that so? Was the cloud fogging? Is that metaphorical? Was it? I mean, obviously, it's representation of Adonai, but could it also be a metaphor for cloudy vision? You're not able to see clearly if there's too much fog in the tabernacle.
That's really interesting. I'll tell you what, I don't want to get into it too much because that is the verse also that I'm like, oh, that's interesting. We should talk about that. And we're going to see how it gets applied way later on. But yeah, 100%. There's a question there, both practically, what does it mean that Moses can't enter, but also, right, what is this cloud, right? We see clouds. This is some of the commentaries, which I did not include here, actually talk a lot about the clouds. And they reference that I think there are 7 times in either the Tanakh or within only Exodus that a cloud appears. We have the cloud that precedes the Israelites as they are leaving Egypt. And this is another sort of version perhaps of that. But often we see also on Sinai, right? There's a God is in a cloud. And so this often will mean, I think, literally the cloud is meant to represent God's presence and where God dwells and that he is there, God is there. But I think there also is perhaps a metaphor that, if the cloud has left, you now have the vision to move forward. Perhaps, yeah. Ben.
Yeah, I think it's more the same thing as Rebecca, and thank you for your commentary, Jeff. This cloud, the magic. Sometimes I have a hard time, well, I shouldn't say hard time, but it's God, it's Adonai, these clouds, it's a little very mystical. And I guess we accept it, but it's a little, the mysticism sometimes gives me a question.
Sure. Tanina.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you got it.
Okay. I think the fact that you said metaphoric way of presenting things, definitely, because there is no real proof of the existence of God actually physically. So all this cloud thing, the reason that we also call the Torah Torat Moshe, we don't call it Torat Adonai, because it was represented to us by a human, and it was Moses. So we call it Torat Moshe till today.
Yeah.
But the idea is that they had to be separated from being like a machine that follows something that you actually, how would I say, mechanically make it work. We have to be separated from this particular idea that a person is like a machine, that we're going to follow only something that another human being is going to mechanically promote us to believe in. It's something that the people have to decide themselves what was the purpose of this whole idea of the new religion. And I think the whole idea every time is represented to us by the fact that he says, Vayakhel, Vayakhel, Vayakhel. He takes them all together in order to make them feel that they're responsible for one another. As a group, they can make things happen. As somebody who believes in the unbelievable and the impossible, they can make it possible because they're going to be together. And it's the same thing before they went to war. He called them all and he made them count, but they were representing one body. A transformation between believing in idols and believing in something tangible and believing in the 10 Commandments, which were yes, it's physical. A lot of the things will be executed physically, but by the person itself. But most of the things is the ability to believe even though you don't have a tangible proof. And
right.
Also the 10 Commandments were there to teach people how to behave with one another. It's not the idea that they have to fulfill the commandment to please God. It's how it will benefit them physically if they are together. How do you believe in a God that will promote you worrying about another person, not acting as a machine? Think and make it happen. So that's why I think they call it Torat Moshe. It was a person who came and showed them that if they're going to be working as a community, it's going to work. They can make things change. They can make things happen. And they are going to be responsible for their own actions. And that's the only way that I look at it and can explain it to myself. That's why it's Torah Moshe. That's why Vayakhel et Bnei Israel. Get them all together. Make it, see how it affects each other where they are together.
Nice.
That's the whole idea.
Thank you.
My book.
I think so. I think we have a similar book, okay. And I think perhaps maybe the same one even, but I think also, perhaps that the cloud here is meant to give that connection, right? Between Torah Moshe, it is a human thing and it's a human job, and yet there's still this aspect of divinity that informs the whole project. And so that perhaps is the cloud. Thank you so much. Is there any other thoughts about about this section? I think I see a hand from Wayne. Is that you?
Yeah, I think that this section is, it's like you were saying, it's like an IKEA instructions on how to, when you take something home, how to build it. And then I think the cloud adds just a visual, magical element to sort of as a process. I mean, I see this section as this whole construction manual is how to bring people into conversion into Judaism. And there's the magical element, and then all of these processes of making the robes and how you do construction and how you assemble a synagogue are the meaning of these details are bringing people into Judaism, into one people, into one religion.
Nice. Yeah, I really appreciate that there's Judaism, perhaps we might even say, is really the marriage between the spiritual and the tangible, about the human connection and the way that it's informed by our understanding of divinity, So I'll move us forward a little bit. I'm glad that we were able to focus on that verse and to bring out other ideas about it than I actually had. When I first read, maybe not first read, but when I read this time, this verse 35, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it and the presence of God filled the tabernacle. I was surprised, actually, because we see all the time Moses communicating with God. We know that Moses is the only person who gets to experience God face to face, whatever that means. And so to me, it was sort of like, well, why is Moses's access now limited? What's the situation here? Unfortunately, there is a little bit of commentary. So we'll look at what the commentators, specifically what Rashi and Tur HaAroch, Rabbi Jacob Ben Asher, will see what they had to say about this particular verse, and then we'll get a little goofy with it. And then we're going to move forward into the Talmud to see how this verse appears and what else it's used for in our history. Is there a volunteer, perhaps, to read Rashi on Exodus 40:35? Go ahead, Susan. Thanks. Oh, you're still muted, Susan. So there you go.
Okay. And Moses was not able to come into the appointed tent. But another verse says, Numbers, and when Moses came into the appointed tent to speak with him, then he heard the voice. There comes, however, a third verse and reconciles these apparently contradictory verses, for it says here, you want to read
the 4. Yeah, ki shachen aleha ha'anan. So ha'anan. So 4, it just is starts there at 4.
Or when the cloud abode thereupon on the appointed tent. Hence you may say, so long as the cloud was upon it, he was not able to come into the appointed tent. But as soon as the cloud disappeared, he entered it and spoke with him. Okay, so the cloud is on top, Moses can't come in. Cloud goes and Moses can enter. Is that
yes? That's what Rashi's saying, and he's trying to understand it by using verse. The thing we have to remember about the medievals and even some people now is that they really had basically the whole tradition just in their heads. They didn't have computers or cell phones to store things for them, so they had the ability to forget. They had the whole Torah in there. They had the Mishnah. They had Talmud. They had all these things. So Rashi reads this verse and immediately thinks about a verse 2 books later, and says, but wait a minute, but Moses was in the tent and speaking to God. So this idea is perhaps that God is still able to speak to Moses, whether or not the cloud is there. So this is one possible explanation for this, but no, they notice also there's a contradiction here, not only because of Moses's track record of speaking with God, but also because literally we have a verse that says he's in the tent speaking to God. So what gives? This is what gives, perhaps. And then we'll move on to a couple of centuries later. We have the Tur HaAroch. This is Rab Jacob ben Asher. He's known as the Tur, like the column. And he also noticed this, and also not only was he aware and had the whole tradition in his head, but he also knew the earlier commentators. So he had read Rashi, and he had read Ramban and Rashban, and he had read Ibn Ezra. And so do we have a volunteer to read this commentary here? Merle, go ahead.
And Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting. And in a different verse, we are told of Moses entering the tent of meeting in order to speak with God, etc. There appears to be some contradiction here. Nachmanides writes that according to the plain meaning of the text, we must understand the words, and I don't read Hebrew.
That's so fair. Numbers. Notice that wasn't with English, but that's the part where Moses does not go into the.
Okay, Numbers not.
Or where he does go into the tent. Sorry, yes.
Moses actually entered the tent, but then he heard the voice of God emanating from the Holy of Holies, and an account of that he did not cross the threshold on account of that he did not cross the threshold of the tabernacle. An alternate explanation of the two verses is that the meaning of the words in our verse is simply that Moses could not enter the tent of meeting without obtaining express permission from God to do so. Upon being invited, he would enter the tent, just as he had been invited to ascend Mount Sinai at the time of the revelation, and had not proceeded without being called upon to do so. Okay.
It's a lot of words, kind of a salad, but if we separate it out into its parts, we understand that Tur HaAroch is noticing the same verse in Numbers and says this is a contradiction. Moses is not allowed to go into the tent because the presence of God is there, but later we have that. And so where Rashi, his idea was that, well, actually, yeah, as soon as the tent leaves, God or Moses can go in, and that's what happened in that sense. Tur HaAroch says, no, actually, that's not what happened there. It wasn't that Moses went in, like that God left and then Moses went in. It was actually that Moses didn't really go all the way in and heard God coming from a different part of it. And that Moses could only enter with express permission from God to do so. And then they give a proof text. So this is all interesting, I think, and is an attempt to try to understand, this potential contradiction in the text, but also I think the broader question of, well, if Moses can't go into the tabernacle when the God is there, then like what's going on with Moses and clouds and God and everything? And that is where we're going to start to shift and turn towards the Talmud, because there's a point at which in Yoma, which is the tractate of the Mishnah and then extended to the Talmud that really deals with Yom Kippur, there's a point where the rabbis find themselves compelled to try to understand just how Moses interacts with the cloud of God. But in order to do that, we have to start in the Mishnah, because this is how the Talmud works. So as a very brief refresher, probably, I know I'm not the first one to bring Talmud to this space, but the rabbis, the Mishnaic rabbis, they had to try to understand the Torah because the Torah has a bunch of commandments and rules, which we understand we need to follow, but a lot of them don't have specifics, or they're stated multiple times in multiple ways. So the Mishnah is really like the first attempt to establish how we actually live the commandments of the Torah. And it's a great text, and also still leaves something to be desired as far as clarity. And there also is this sort of historical reality that we don't know if the rabbis of the Mishnah or anybody really ever lived the way that they wrote. So we're not totally sure exactly if they were describing an ideal situation or if they were describing the way that people lived their lives. But in any case, later generations realized they needed to give further explanation onto the Mishnah. That became known as Gemara. So when you look at the Talmud, you're always looking at Mishnah and Gemara responding to the Mishnah and trying to understand what exactly does this mean. And sometimes it is very practical and it's like a one-to-one, but most of the time it gets a little convoluted and takes us down different paths. So that's going to happen today. And we're going to skip a lot because the Mishnah that we're responding to is the very first Mishnah in Tractate Yoma in the Talmud. So the Talmud always starts, every page has two sides. There's an A side and a B side, and it starts on page 2. I'm not actually sure why. But so the beginning of 2a is our Mishnah, and we're going to continue to respond to that same Mishnah for several more pages. So I want to make sure that we have the base Mishnah that we're responding to, and then we'll jump ahead to where it starts to make sense for us so we can understand what's the discussion that is prompting them to get to Moses in Exodus chapter 40. Any questions before we start?
Yes, remind me what Yoma means.
Yoma is Yom. It means like day, but it
Day, that's what I
specifically is
thought.
Yom Kippur.
But the A at the end is.
Yoma is, so that's Aramaic. So a lot of the Talmud functions in Aramaic or different forms of Hebrew. And so, but the Aramaic, I think it's actually Palestinian Aramaic, which is what we know as the Aramaic that was spoken in the land of Israel during the time of the Talmud. That's how it's understood. That Aramaic often uses a convention of an aleph at the end of words. Like I think if you look at the Kaddish, I believe that's that style of Aramaic. And then there's Babylonian Aramaic, which actually takes up more of, which is more present in the Babylonian Talmud, which is the Talmud that we most often study and the one that's considered canonical. You still get some fun olives. You get lots of nuns at the end of things, which is sort of an Aramaization. And yeah, it's but it also can be very confusing because sometimes words are sort of opposite between Hebrew and Aramaic too. So that's a fun thing to learn. I'm a big fan of Aramaic.
That's a great explanation. I thought that Yom would be day, but I didn't know what the A was. So
Yeah.
is the Mishnah in Aramaic?
The Mishnah is written mostly in Hebrew.
That's what I
But
thought.
the Talmud is written mostly in, I don't know if it's mostly, but it's largely in Aramaic. Like there are some tractates that have a lot of Hebrew, but there are some that as you go through the sugya, you're like, whoa, there is nothing Hebrew in this at all. Like I understand it, but I need a lot of dictionaries to get myself through this.
Oh, okay.
So,
Great.
yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. No problem. Happy to help. And it's a different type of Hebrew too, actually. There's like Rabbinic Hebrew, which is different than biblical Hebrew, which both inform modern Hebrew, which are, maybe look a little bit like if you're studying Maimonides in the original Hebrew, is sort of like a mix between them because there was a big source text for Ben Yehuda when he was helping pioneers. So it's really great. Yeah, Panina, before we get started, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think the fact that it was written in a certain place, it, how would I say, make the reason for the language to be different. It's where it was written and how much of it would be permissible by the people that lived in the country where we didn't own when we wrote the Talmud or okay, certain things were written in Jerusalem because there was one yeshiva that was remained there even though they were exiled. So I think when it was written in Aramaic, it definitely was when they were in they were not in Israel. And the other one was written when they still lived there. So I think the political situation and the social situation was different by whoever interpreted it and where they were. If you take the Rambam was a doctor, and he doctored the women of the place also. They said that there was a tent and he would put his hand through, and so he wouldn't look at the person, just feel the area where they were aching. And also women. So it shows you also that his perspective of the interpretations could be different, because he was allowed to do things that other people, as a doctor, he could do and the others did not. So we have to consider who is the person who really wrote it and what influenced them to write wherever it is that they wrote. It makes a big difference. And we always forget that because we ourselves don't live in Israel right now, and everybody has their own reasons. But I think that the way and the reasons that made us be where we are also will reflect the way we understand it and the way we want to understand it. So
Totally.
the language definitely shows you the freedom. That was a certain amount of freedom that surrounded the people who wrote it. If it was written in Hebrew, it might have been written in Israel, in Jerusalem or whatever, and the rest of it may not. So again, I'm saying the political situation, the mental position of a woman in the society, and even the men, they weren't responsible for themselves because the authority could do whatever they want with them. So we have to understand all this. So the best thing to do is compare maybe. What would you do if you'd be not where you are now, and try to understand why it was written?
There's also, thank you, Panina, you're totally right. And also one other thing that you made me think of that we should consider is that the rabbis of the Talmud who wrote either in Babylon or in Jerusalem also communicated with each other by letters, and they traveled. And so sometimes, right, you'll find in the Jerusalem Talmud, you'll look and you're like, well, this is very much like you would expect more Hebrew, but there's a lot of Aramaic. And then if you go back, it's because they're citing the ruling from Bavel or vice versa. And so it's a fascinating thing, what the language is and what it's about.
And we cannot forget that during Europe, the occupation of the Inquisition, they had scholars who came out of there and settled in Rome and were influenced by positive feelings to the people who took shelter there. And they were given a big amount of freedom. So the whole idea that they came out from the Inquisition and then going into other countries in Europe, if those countries were favorable to them, the ruling might have been changed in their own writings. So it's not just two people that will make the impression of what happened and how you would think.
Right. And it doesn't stop.
Same situation that will be presented to you in the Bible. It could be written it could be read in 4 different places, and in 4 different places, whatever it is that the culture influenced the situation of the Jews at the place, that's the way they will explain it and translate it. So it's very it's not going to be even in any shape or form to try to translate the same sentence one way according to wherever they were. And
which is another great
in cahoot with the other person.
Which is another great reminder also that we're going to be looking at a translation. And I want to be clear that it's not my translation, actually. This is like the Koren Steinsaltz translation of all these things. So they're wordier than I would have used, but it also reflects the ideology. These are Orthodox Jews who have translated and interpreted this text for us versus our, progressive Jewish, Reform mindset. So we're going to see a lot of different things.
Things are changing. Even the religious boys are now by law has to participate in the army. They have to serve in the army. So things are changing all the time.
Okay, but things that have remained the same for thousands of years is this Mishnah. So I'm going to transition. Thank you so much, Panina. I really appreciate that's like adds color. It really to help us understand what is going on when we look at Talmud and when we think about Jewish thought over the time. But for now, let's look here in Mishnah Yoma, and we'll get into the Talmud. So, is there a volunteer to read the opening of Tractate Yoma for us? If not, I'm always happy to. I'll do this one, and we'll move. Oh, wait, I saw a hand. Was that Ben? Was that your hand or Brad?
I can do it, Rabbi.
Okay, go for it.
7 days prior to Yom Kippur, the sages would remove the high priest, who performs the entire Yom Kippur service, from his house to the chamber of the Parhedron, a room in the temple designated specifically for the high priest during that period.
Let me pause 1 second. So just as something that you'll notice as we go, there are words that are bolded and words that are not. In this iteration of Talmud, it's from Sefaria, as you're probably sure that you know that. The bold words are more or less the direct translation. Those are the words that exist in the Hebrew or the Aramaic. The other words are a gloss, because the rabbis, they wrote in what for them was complete sentences, but not for us. And so there's a lot that has to be done to understand really what are they saying. So these less bolded parts are the gloss, the interpretation on the translation. And so we're pretty sure that's what it means, but take it with, perhaps a small grain of salt. Thank you for letting me pause. Rebecca, go ahead.
And they would designate another priest in his stead to replace him, lest a disqualification due to impurity or another circumstance beyond his control prevent him from entering the temple on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yehuda says the sages would even designate another wife for him, lest his wife die, as it is stated in the Torah portion of the Yom Kippur service, and it will atone for him and for his house. Leviticus 16:6. The sages interpreted the term his house, that is, his wife. The priest must be married in order to fulfill this commandment. Due to the concern lest his wife die, another wife was designated to address that possibility. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda, if so, that this is a concern, there is no end to the matter. And if the designated replacement wife dies, the possibility need not be a source of concern.
So that last part is kind of goofy. It's like, I really love the rabbis and their concerns. Like, but if we have to keep her, like, what happens if we just keep, the replacement wives keep dying? Like, what do we do? And so they decided that is probably not going to happen. So we don't need to be so worried about it. So here the Mishnah is letting us know what the high priest needs to do leading up to Yom Kippur. Remember, in ancient times, the high priest was responsible for expiation, for the atonement of all of the people's sins, for his house, but also for the entire people of Israel. And so it was crucial. It was like a matter of deep concern that he would be properly prepared. But also, remember, in the time of the Mishnah and after, there is no more temple. So they're both trying to understand back what would happen, try to understand how they should do it, should they be so lucky as to do it again. God willing, that's what they're really hoping for. And they are really trying to get it right. And by the time we get to the Talmud, to the Gemara, they're also still really trying to get it right. They want to be sure. And so this prompts them to have a discussion for every Mishnah where they really break it down into its constituent parts and try to understand just what is it saying to us, what does it mean, and how do we live this way. So what we're going to get into, there's plenty of material on all of it, but we're going to get into a discussion about this idea of removing the high priest in general. This idea of sort of sequestration, that the priest has to be away from his home and from his wife and doing these purities for a week. So the rabbis have questions, right? Like, why is it a week? Why do we know how to do this at all? Is this important? And how do we ensure that we're following it from not only correctly, but also with the right source for why we're doing it? So
Excuse
now,
me, Pardon, you repeat
go
this?
ahead. Yeah.
The high priest has to be sequestered for a week. Is that what you're saying?
That's what they're saying. I
Okay.
don't, I would say yes. That's what it seems like. That's what it describes, I think, in all of the
Yes, and 7
issues of
days
this.
prior.
7 days prior to Yom Kippur.
Yeah. And remove him, he has to go to his house, is that it? And to make this simpler, and the house has to have a wife.
So it's from his house. He leaves his house and goes to the chamber of Parhedrin, which
Oh,
we can look
we
in.
don't know
It's
what that
literally
is.
Parhedrin. I also don't totally know what it is, as I have not been to the Holy Temple of Jerusalem, but I believe it's a room separate from the Holy of Holies. It is like within the temple complex, there's the outside walls, and then the inner walls, and then the courtyard, and then the other inner wall, and then the innermost. And so this is probably in that courtyard, another room where the priest would go, where he would probably pray, and they would burn incense, and they would do all kinds of different things to make sure that he's purified. He might go into a mikveh multiple times, I think probably every day. And this idea about the wife in general is they're just saying there's this verse that implies that when all this is going on, this is atoning for himself and for his house. And so his house, they interpret to mean his wife. Literally in the Hebrew, it even says like Beito, Zotisha, like Zoishto, like that's his wife. And so the concern is if he doesn't have a wife, then how could that happen? And if that doesn't happen, then how can anything else happen?
So this is very interesting and all new to me, for the 7 days, and there's a wife that has to be with him because he has to atone for her too.
But
So,
not with him physically, with him marriedly, but she's still at home. He's by himself.
oh, she's still at home, so they don't go in there and have sex, is what
No.
you're saying. Okay, so she's at home, but he has to atone for her. Then they have, in case she dies, they have a substitute wife. They also have a stand-in for him as well,
Let's
correct?
see.
If he
Maybe.
dies-
Penina, you're saying no. What do you got?
When Israel brought the Yemenites from Yemen in, when was it, 57, I think, in 19, they came with more than one wife. They were
Right.
married to many
Yeah,
wives.
nice.
And they brought all the wives with them. And when the government tried to separate them, the wife was crying because they couldn't hold the job. They didn't even know how to, they came barefoot and with many wives. And finally, the government decided to leave them as they are because the letter from Rabbi Gershon ben Yehuda didn't arrive Yemen. That was the one who made the law that you only allowed to marry one wife. So they came still with many wives and were permitted to keep them in 1957 till this generation died out literally. And then the new law was that if you want to get married after you don't have any wife, then it's okay to get married, but the only one wife. Because the law didn't exist there, and it didn't arrive there because the Jews in Yemen were too far away from the how do you say the space or the distance that it took for the congregation in Yemen to even receive any kind of instructions from the outside world that didn't, I don't even know if they knew that they existed. So by the time they came to Israel, and I'm telling you again, in these our days when we were still, we are alive, and I witnessed it. And not only that, they came with many children, and the government actually took freedom with the babies and gave them to Holocaust survivors who came with and lost everything. And it became a big scandal later in Israel, what happened to those babies that were taken from these people that came with so many wives and babies. They were told that the kid was sick and died, which was a disgrace of what happened. And they gave them as to be adopted by people who lost everything at the Holocaust.
This is something that,
Penina,
I want to.
Only later they brought it back up and it went back to trial. But this lifestyle that keeps on being what is the allowed and not allowed is very, very complicated.
Yeah.
Very. And again, I'm saying the circumstances of what they went through on both ends justified a lot of things at the time that the government thought was permissible. And not everything worked.
Yes. All right, Penny, I want to move us back into the Mishnah, but yeah, certainly that's still articles and investigations are still coming out about that today. It's certainly
That's right.
an important
That's right.
part of Israeli history.
But they did not receive the letter from Rabbi Gershon ben Yehuda till many, many years later, to tell them that it's not allowed according to the Jewish law to marry more than one wife.
Yes, correct. Okay, wait, Brad, did you have your hand up still? Did you have something you wanted to say or ask?
Yeah, I just was hoping we could get back to the text and to get back to Moses and the cloud and the fire, which is, I think, where you're hoping to get at some point.
So we're here. So we're now moving forward. So we've now jumped ahead from Talmud 2a, and there's 2b, and then 3a. We're now on page 3b of this Talmud because they have been discussing the Mishnah for some time. And this is Gemara. But now I want to get up to where they finally get to this question, where they're trying to understand, why is it a 7-day sequestration? What's going on there? And this will lead us into the cloud eventually. And I'll read this just to kind of keep us moving. But here, we're going to get into this. And there was some discussion, by the way, about the sequestration and where one derives that from on page 2b and on 3a, but this is where it really starts to crystallize for us. So Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, rather, from where do you, master, derive the halakha of sequestering before Yom Kippur? So somebody had already suggested something. We're not going to get into that because it's complicated, but now Reish Lakish says, I derive it from Sinai. As it is written, and the glory of the Lord abode above Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered him, vayaksehu, which is the Hebrew that we have, 6 days. And he called to Moses on the 7th day from the midst of the cloud. Here is another gloss letting us know the masculine suffix hu and vayaksehu means either God or the mountain were covered by God. Now, since it states, and God called Moses on the 7th day, what is derived from the previous explicit mention of 6 days? These 6 days are mentioned as a paradigm, from which a general principle is derived that anyone who enters the camp of divine presence, the site of the revelation at Mount Sinai, or the place where the divine presence rests, the Holy of Holies, requires sequestering for 6 days of sanctification. So this comes from in the Torah, before the revelation at Mount Sinai, God tells Moses to tell the people that they have to sequester themselves, they leave their wives, they come to the foot of the mountain, they purify for this period of time. And that is sort of where, so Reish Lakish says, that's where it all comes from. This whole 7 days comes from Sinai. But now, the Gemara, and it says the Gemara asks, and it is because often we don't know which rabbi or which sage said it. And there's also this concept of the stam, which is the sort of like mysterious, invisible, hidden sort of redactor, editor of the Talmud, who perhaps they also understand maybe wrote in certain parts like this to make it make more sense and to try to connect parts. So the Gemara asks, wasn't it 7, not 6 days of sequestering that we learned in the Mishnah? Reish Lakish answered, the Mishnah that requires sequestering for 7 days is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, who is concerned with the purity of his home. Meaning he's concerned that, and they explain that this means that they're concerned that if it was a shorter amount of time, the priest might go home, and if his wife is menstruating, he might contact her and ruin the whole process. This is what the rabbis, or at least the Koren Steinsaltz interpretation, believes that the rabbis were concerned about. So this now gives us the framing for what we're about to go into. We're trying to understand why 7 days of isolation first. What is going on there? And Reish Lakish tells us it's because it mirrors the revelation at Sinai, when Moses would go up to the present and when the people would encounter God at the mountain, they had to be sequestered. Now we'll move forward again to, now we're on Yoma 4a, the 10th sort of baraita from that. So we've jumped ahead to another page because we need to understand how this connects to Moses. So A baraita, which is sort of a sourceless teaching. It's something that you won't find directly referenced in the Mishnah, but is understood to be from that time. Some baraitot you can find mention of in other places, like in Midrash, but for the most part, it's just sort of, it's like a thing that they knew that we don't know. And we don't know how they knew it, but they knew it, and they're just saying, so this is taught. A baraita was taught in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish that sequestering is derived from Sinai. Moses ascended in the cloud and was covered in the cloud and was sanctified in the cloud in order to receive the Torah for the Jewish people in sanctity, as it is stated, and the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai. And the cloud covered him 6 days, and God called to Moses on the 7th day from the midst of the cloud. This was an incident that occurred after the revelation of the 10 Commandments to the Jewish people, and these 6 days were the beginning of the 40 days that Moses was on the mountain. This is, and it tells us after that, that was the statement of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili. So Rabbi Yosei HaGalili looks at what Reish Lakish said and says, but that happened after the 10 Commandments. So your timeline is a little bit off. But it does correspond still that Moses withdrew for 6 days before receiving permission to stand in the presence of God. Rabbi Akiva differs and says that this occurred before the revelation of the 10 Commandments. And when the Torah says, and the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, it actually refers to the revelation of the divine presence that began on the new moon of Sivan, which is 10 days or 6 days before the revelation of the 10 Commandments. So I'm reading a lot, kind of going quickly, but I want to clarify what's happening is that right now we've just tried to figure out why the 7 days, and they say, Reish Lakish says it's from Sinai. So that seems to be, at this point, more or less established for the rabbis in this conversation, that the sequestration derives from Sinai. But now there's a disagreement. Did the sequestration happen before or after the 10 Commandments were revealed? So they go forward. Now we're going to skip a little bit more and go on to page 4b, because we're there, we know it's Sinai, and we know that it's before or after Revelation, and this is going to connect us to Moses in the cloud in the tent very soon. So, that which is written, and the cloud covers him, means the cloud covered it, the mountain, and not him, Moses. This was a discussion we had before, right? Is the vayaksehu, is the who, the he, the mountain or Moses? So this says that it is Moses. And he called to Moses. Moses and all of the Jewish people were standing at the foot of the mountain listening. And if God did not mean that Moses was to climb the mountain, then why did God call to Moses? The verse comes only to accord deference to Moses. Rabbi Natan says, Moses was in fact called to enter the cloud. However, his entrance was not for the purpose of sequestering and purifying him. Rather, the verse comes only to cleanse the food and drink that was in his intestines, to render him like the ministering angels who require neither food nor drink. So this is another, kind of wacky Talmud moment. But we're going forward. We're trying to understand Moses was called to the cloud, right? So we're still thinking about the time period. But now we're really getting into the details. So the rabbis are a little bit distracted. They're sort of like, I don't know if anyone has ever worked with young kids, but, sort of a non sequitur. If you're, but the sequitur is just a thing, and it's like, oh my gosh, for lunch, I had oranges. I love oranges. Orange is the color of basketballs. I love to play basketball. Have you seen LeBron James? Like, this is sort of the way that the Talmud works sometimes. And so here is sort of how it's working. So again, we've gone from the priest must sequester for 7 days. Well, where did we get that from? We got it from Sinai. But which part of Sinai? I don't know, but Moses was called into the cloud. But how did Moses get called into the cloud, and why and when? So Rabbi Matya ben Harash says, the verse calling Moses into the cloud comes only to intimidate Moses, to instill in him a sense of awe of the Creator, so that the Torah would be delivered with reverence, with quaking, with trembling, as it is said, serve the Lord with awe and rejoice with trembling, which is from the Psalms. We also might understand that the mountain itself and the earth was trembling at the revelation, but they decided to reference the Psalm here. Apropos the end of the verse, the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of and rejoice with trembling? These seem contradictory to them. Maybe not to us, because we understand the idea of like no ra as like a fear of awesome, and it's not necessarily like being terrified or being impressed, but it's something of sort of this just maybe it's both together. Rav Ada bar Matana said that Rav said, we've got someone else citing someone else, where there is joy of fulfilling a mitzvah, there will be the trembling of the awe of heaven there. So this is a nice little bit, but it doesn't help us with our cloud or with Moses. So we'll keep moving. Apropos the interpretation of the verse with regard to Revelation, the Gemara asks, what do Rabbi Yossi HaGalili and Rabbi Akiva actually disagree about? Right? Because one said it happened before the revelation at Sinai, the 6 days, and one said it, or before the 10 commandments, and one said after, right? The Gemara explains their dispute is parallel to the disputes between these other Tanaim, these sort of original rabbinic sages, as it was taught in a Baraita. On the 6th day of the month of Sivan, the Torah was given to the Jewish people. Rabbi Yosei says it was on the 7th day of the month. According to the one who said it was on the 6th, the Torah was given on the 6th, which is the day of revelation of the 10 commandments. And on the 7th day of the month, Moses ascended the mountain, as it is written, and he called Moses on the 7th day. According to one who said that the Torah was given on the 7th of the month, it was given on the 7th, and Moses ascended on the 7th, as it is written, and he called to Moses on the 7th day. So now we're trying to figure out what day did we even receive the Torah while Moses is up there, and was it while Moses is up there, right? We're going to move forward a little bit more because we're almost out of time and I want us to get there. But here we have a moment that's important. So we're trying to figure out what's going on with Moses on the mountain and the cloud covering it, right? Didn't they already receive the 10 commandments on the 6th of the month? And the cloud that was on the mountain had already departed on the 6th of the month? Because now there's a question, right? The cloud was on the mountain. That was sort of where we started. Vayaksehu, the cloud covered him. Was it Moses or the mountain? Meanwhile, the cloud we're just taking for granted that the cloud is there. And now we've introduced this idea that actually the cloud already left before Moses went up there, which is, again, confusing. So we're trying to understand one real, Panina, I'm going to keep moving, but I'll try and get you in. So now we're trying to understand, right? What day was it? What month is it? And if they got the Torah and they got the 10 commandments, but then then Moses shattered the 10 commandments. So when did all of that happen? And we're still trying to understand. And then we finally get back, according to Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, who said there were 6 days of sequestering after the Torah was given, and an additional 40 days that Moses was on the mountain, the tablets were not shattered until the 23rd of Tammuz. The 40 days that Moses was on the mountain include the 6 days of sequestering. Okay, cool, interesting, but we're still not there yet. So I'm going to skip us all the way ahead. Sorry, I realize there's a lot of this and we spent more time. But so here it is. Now we've discussed Moses is in the cloud on the mountain. We don't know exactly when and where, but Rabbi Zarika, which is a great name because it implies that he's throwing things out, raised a contradiction between verses before Rabbi Elazar. And some say that Rabbi Zarika said that Rabbi Elazar raised the contradiction. In any case, it is written in one place, and Moses was not able to enter into the tent of meeting because the cloud dwelt on it, as Moses was unable to enter the cloud. But it's written elsewhere, and Moses came into the cloud. This teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, grabbed Moses and brought him into the cloud, since he could not enter on his own. And this sparks a fascinating discussion where they try to teach what actually happened when Moses was in the cloud. There's a thought that perhaps this cloud was like the sea and it parted. So Moses doesn't actually touch the cloud. Moses is between the cloud and can hear God. And so that's why Moses can't enter when the cloud's on the ark, because Moses doesn't really go into the cloud. He just goes near the cloud. And there's another that discusses that actually this is just a lesson. And perhaps this will be our final part, and it is, and maybe is our lesson for the day, which we don't always have to study Torah and receive a moral or a lesson, but often we do. I think that Torah lishma is just good, Torah for its own sake, but we may as well get something out of it. So the verse says, and God called unto Moses, and God spoke to him from within the tent of meeting, saying, and by the way, this is the very next verse after we finish our book. We finish the book of Exodus, and God called unto Moses, and the Lord spoke to him from within the tent of meeting, saying, and then saying things. So the question is, why does the verse mention calling before speaking? And God did not speak to him at the outset. The Torah is teaching etiquette. A person should not say anything to another unless he calls him first. We might understand this is like a greeting. Like you shouldn't go in and like, sit down at the table and order your food without saying hi to the waiter and asking how they are, right? This supports the opinion of Rabbi Hanina. As Rabbi Hanina said, a person should not say anything until he calls him first. With regard to the term concluding the verse, saying, Rabbi Musia, grandson of Rabbi Masya, is a great name, said in the name of Rabbi Musia the Great. This is Musia ben Masya ben Musia, from where it derived. With regard to one who tells another some matter, it's incumbent upon the latter not to say it to others until the former explicitly says to him, go and tell others. As it is stated, and the Lord spoke to him from the tent of the meeting, saying, say. So, I'm going to skip that last part of the English because I think it actually confuses us and doesn't help. So this is a very roundabout way, right, to get to a lesson, which is essentially greet people before you start trying to tell them stuff, but also, right, don't tell people things unless you've been given permission to share. This is something that comes from the Talmud there as well. So the reason that we went on this kind of convoluted journey today was A, because it's fun and that's what I like to do. I love Talmud and studying and thinking about the way the rabbis think. But B, because I wanted to sort of represent how even though we might be talking about one thing in the Torah, our rabbis can use, and not just our rabbis, but you as Jewish people who study the text can think about how to apply it elsewhere, not only in our world, but into our tradition, and can really find all these different connections. Yeah. So that's our lesson for today. Ben, you have your hand raised. Penina, I know you had your hand up before. Yeah.
Well, I know we're out of time, but
Yeah.
that was very interesting when you brought that back, and speak, to speak until spoken to, or you want people to listen. But it's interesting also, and I don't know this, I'm not trying to be silly, but so much talk of the cloud and how the cloud was part of this. And today, the cloud is a big part of our world as well, and a part of how we communicate as well. So,
and we still don't understand how it works. I don't get how the cloud works. Does anyone? What does it mean? Put something in the cloud?
A little bit, but yeah, interesting though. Kind of the Torah always delivers, right?
Yeah. Susan, then Penina.
Yeah, so I love the bottom line when we got to the end, but there's also something that was in the beginning with one of the rabbis saying he didn't go in until he was invited in. And some of that's true too. And we know that like in a hospital session, when you're visiting somebody, you don't barge into their room. You knock and you have to be invited in. So there's that kind of consideration. So I'm glad we got to the end because it gave us a good moral. So, and we didn't have to deal with the wives.
Totally.
And substitute wives.
Yeah. Penina, then Brad.
Okay, I'm going to try to make it short. The sentence שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות didn't make us like the rest of the nations, of the people. The whole Torah was supposed to show humanity, to teach us humanity, to consider the crowd, ויקהל את בני ישראל, over and over again. He puts them all together to try to solve it, how to live together with other people. And the words have definitely a specific meaning. Where it says ויקהל את בני ישראל is be responsible for one another. The rules are made of how to live with another people, not with other gods. And that's very important when you hear the word ויקהל, ויקהל, ויקהל. The whole idea is to form a קהילה. People should be living with other people and be considerate of other people. And that's why women do not sit next to men in a religious temples, because it's not of what the men do. It's because it might look like maybe there is going to be an illicit love affair between a married woman and a man. So they don't even sit next to each other, so nobody would even assume it. So it's every word has such a big weight on the behavior and how to build this community to trust each other and to live with each other. And that's the cloud, up and down, going away and coming back, going away, because new situations come up all the time. And you have to learn how to live with them and actually solve them with it should be fair to all the people involved.
Yes.
So that's Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
Shalom. All right. Lunchtime, everybody. Goodbye.